Well, welcome. Permaculture. What is this thing they keep mentioning? This thing they call permaculture? Is it some cool hippie thing that came out of the 60s? A little bit of that, perhaps. A little bit of 60s style rebellion and protest. In fact, Bill Mollison, the co founder and what many of us call the father of permaculture, he finally realized protesting did nothing. It accomplished nothing, and that it might be a better idea to design and implement and create the world we wanted rather than protesting against the world we didn't want. It was in 1974, if I recall the story, where Bill Mollison, at that time a professor at the University of Tasmania, met a student at another university who was studying ecological design, which was a new concept at the time. And his name was David Holmgren. I believe Holmgren went to a conference where Bill Mollison was speaking, and this was probably in 1974, when Holmgren was this 19-year-old student. He was impressed with Mollison and the way he spoke at this conference, and he thought, that's where I am. That's the way I think about things. I want to meet this guy. So he went and met this guy, Bill Mollison, after the conference, after his talk. And they ended up having a relationship, and I believe David Holmgren moved in with him and lived with him for a while. So for 4 years, they put together this concept of permaculture. And according to a video that I have listened to, that I've watched and listened to by David Holmgren, Holmgren had this question about ecology, the study of ecology, the branch of ecology, that concept, and landscape architecture, and agriculture. Those three, he could see where there was some overlap between two of those on occasion, but he couldn't see where there was the three combined, where landscape architecture, ecology, and agriculture were combined. And he had a question about that, and this is one of the things he discussed with Mollison. And Mollison agreed that was interesting. And his comment was, well, why is it that when we look at our common agriculture, that they don't emulate forest systems, natural forest systems, which are very efficient ecosystems? And why do our agricultural systems operate nothing like that and look nothing like that? That was a spark for Holmgren. He had a thesis he was working on, and he needed a subject, and that became it. That was 74, I believe, and in 78, the manuscript that Holmgren worked on bounced back and forth with Mollison for additions and corrections and ideas. That became Permaculture 1 in 1978. And Bill Mollison would have been 50 at that time, a different generation from David Holmgren, who would have been 23 at that time. So, does that answer the question, what is permaculture? Well, permaculture is a design system for sustainable and regenerative human settlements. That's in a nutshell. It encompasses zoology, biology, landscape architecture, ecology, forest systems, agriculture, communities, villages, transportation. It encompasses everything. Permaculture is everything. It started out, Permaculture 1, as the concept of permanent and agriculture. Very quickly, both of these gentlemen realized that without a permanent culture, sustainable culture, agriculture was going nowhere. They knew this from studying civilizations that had failed. Whether it was Tigris and Euphrates, Fertile Crescent, Mayan civilizations, Andes, ancient Rome, these places, once they blew through their soil, once they ruined their ability to grow their own food, the civilization soon declined. If you don't have a sustainable culture, you're not going to have a sustainable, permanent agriculture. Permaculture is a design system for human settlements, sustainable and regenerative, because we have ruined a lot of our natural systems. We have depleted water resources, we have depleted forest resources, and we keep building things when we're not using what we've already made. We take these things and we throw them in the landfill, and we build new things. There are houses all over this country where I live, United States of America, houses that are vacant. We keep building new ones. That's not sustainable. We are going to become the final plague of this world if we don't start getting this together. So, that's where permaculture came from. Permaculture, a design system for sustainable and regenerative human settlements. Now, these two gentlemen cooked up a pretty good plan here, and they had ethics and principles along with them. And when they studied ancient civilizations, when they studied sustainable cultures, Aboriginal people, they realized that the ethics that they had boiled down to basically three: earth care, people care, and what has become known as fair share, which is return of surplus to the first two, which is earth care and people care. So whatever we develop, whatever we manufacture, whatever we grow, whatever surplus we have, it needs to go back into earth care, people care. If it doesn't, it's not permaculture. So that's relatively simple. Earth care, people care, and fair share. With fair share, originally, I think Mollison and Holmgren talked about limiting population growth, which is a touchy subject sometimes, limiting consumption. What they basically meant by that, from what I've read, from videos I've seen, from things that I've heard discussed by both of them, is that we can't keep expanding consumerism, which basically means more is if we have more consumers, we're going to have more consumerism. We have to get a hold on that. So from 78 to 2003, those 25 years, those were the formative development years of permaculture. 78 was the book Permaculture 1 by Holmgren and Mollison. At that point, Holmgren went, and because he was such a young man, he was such a young student, he went and decided to try these permaculture principles, to put them to use, to put them on the ground, to put them in the soil. So he did that for years. Mollison, being a man at 50 years of age, a tenured university professor, took these concepts, took the permaculture concept, and started spreading it around the globe. So they had two different paths at this point. I believe in 78, right after that, Permaculture 2, which was penned by Mollison without Holmgren, that might have been 1980. I'm drawing a blank on Permaculture 2, but it wasn't too long after Permaculture 1. And then the epic book that Mollison put together, the Permaculture Designer's Manual, Permaculture A Designer's Manual, was 1988. 600-page textbook. It's very thick, it's dense, it's substantial, it's deep, and it is what a lot of us in the permaculture world refer to as the Permaculture Bible. That was 1988. Now, it wasn't too long before Mollison and company realized that was a thick book. It was difficult. So he basically summarized that book, and in 1991 put out Intro to Permaculture. which is an easier read. Permaculture, A Designer's Manual, great reference. It's like an encyclopedia. It's like a tech manual. And keep in mind, we're not going to spend a weekend in the cabin reading through a tech manual on how an automobile works or on how a refrigerator works. That's difficult reading. But the Intro to Permaculture in 1991 is a fantastic book to get started. Fantastic book. Okay. Principles. We've talked about ethics a little bit. Principles of permaculture. In Permaculture, A Designer's Manual, Mollison, one of the first couple pages, he brings up that cooperation, not competition, is the key. Cooperation, not competition, is the key. Now that would have been 1988. David Holmgren, after he spent time again taking these permaculture concepts, putting them out in the land, designing sustainable settlements, he came up with an equally impressive book called Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. That was 2002. I was talking a little bit earlier about the formative years of permaculture, 1978 with Permaculture 1, 25 years after that, 2002, when David Holmgren put together the book Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. He covers 12 principles, and I'm not going to recite them all. And that's how his book is set up. Each chapter is over one of the 12 principles. His first one is to observe and interact. And I can tell you, there's a reason why that's the first principle. I find myself dealing with observation and seeing the value in observation daily, if not many times per day, when I'm out looking at what I'm doing, whether it's in town, whether it's on my little permaculture garden farm here, whether I'm just thinking through a process, whether I'm reading online, trying to watch a video, or whatever it is. Observation is huge. And then, of course, if someone just observes and thinks, well, that's great. If you want to pass things on to people, you can teach, but are you accomplishing anything? Now, some might say observation is fantastic. Take the information and you interact with students and you give it to them. That's fantastic. I also want to do this stuff, so I'm out here trying to implement as many of these things as possible. One of my best stories about observation and interaction, not being from Florida, where I live now, spent most of my years in the West, some in North Georgia, some in Virginia. I wasn't used to alligators. So where I am in Central Florida, alligators are prevalent. They are any body of water bigger than a bathtub, you have to assume it's going to attract an alligator or two. So at the foot of our property is a 3 to 4 acre wetland. And I just knew there were alligators there. And one day we proved it as we were back in our scrub area and we saw one. And it was about 2 feet long. I was like, well, that's a 2 foot long alligator. My girlfriend Janet said, well, 2 foot long alligators came from somewhere and they're gonna grow and be something. I was like, yeah. I took a picture of the alligator, circulated, and said, wow, you got alligators there. That's amazing. Yes, yes. I was afraid to go to the pond and get that water. What a resource. The pond and the wetland. Water. Right there. Am I going to rely on the electric pump, pay the utility bill? Am I going to go to the pond to get water? So I was scared about that. Well, it wasn't too long after that where we had a problem. We were inundated with feral pigs. That's a problem because even though nature doesn't till per se, in general, doesn't till like the human beings do, it does have some situations where soil is disturbed by animals. And some of these trenches, some of these spots were 6 to 9 inches. That's similar to the way I would till my garden, the way I would get my soil, the old conventional way I would get my garden ready to plant. So these feral pigs, I observed them and I watched them, and I noticed that some of these pig mamas with their pig babies were going back to the wetland area doing their thing, coming back. So I watched where they were going. There was one area that was like an inlet, and you could walk to this area, and there was an animal path that they had created, and you could see on either side if there was anything like an alligator or another animal there. You could walk right up, so you had a good viewing angle to see because it was a nice little inlet. And I was like, okay. And I watched them go down in there, and it got to the point where the feral pigs weren't that afraid of me because they didn't see a threat. And they would walk down into this area, and I also noticed that where they were going, the water was shallow. And they would get down there, and they would do their wallow and waddle and get all wet, drink some water, and then come out of there. And I'm like, okay. I thought, well, maybe they just knew the time to go. I said, well, wasn't that? You had a good angle to view. You could see if there was any danger, and the water was shallow. The water was shallow, so you would see if there was an alligator in there. So I was like, okay, cool. Now I can go down to the pond. I can get some pond muck, which is great fertilizer. I can use that to complement my rainwater if it's not been raining very often, and in the winter here we get some dry periods. I can go down there and grab water. It's good exercise for me too. So that's my best story about observation and interaction. Again, that's the first of 12 principles in David Holmgren's book, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. Okay, so I have told you who and when for the permacultures and why and the ethics, etc., etc. Well, I'm going to give you something that I've come up with. One thing I've noticed, and I've read a lot of permaculture books, is that in some cases, besides it being complicated, but some people are left out an important aspect of site design. And I think the first thing that we need to do when we do a site design, when we set up, whether it's an existing structure, an existing property, an existing settlement, or whether it's one we're building from the ground, know your sun. First thing you got to do is know your sun. Obviously, it's important to stow your water. And then we want to grow plants, right? Well, if you don't grow soil, if you don't get the soil right, plants are going to suffer. Your plants and trees will suffer. So I came up with this mnemonic, and I hope it's helpful. And that is, for every site, you got to know your sun, stow your water, grow your soil. So know, stow, and grow. Know your sun, stow your water, grow your soil. Well, when I first started studying permaculture, my opinion was sunrise is in the east. That's where relative to the earth rotation, and it sets in the west. What's so difficult about that? Well, depending on your latitude, in general, yes, it does rise in the eastern side, and it sets in the western side. But unless you're in the tropics, it doesn't really rise directly in the east and set directly in the west 12 months out of the year. Now, for everyone, March 21st and September 21st or 22nd, right around there. Not an expert in this area. The thing I do know is that's when you have 12 hours of sunlight, daylight, 12 hours of night, 12 hours of sun. You have 12 and 12. And that's due to the rotation of the earth, revolution of the earth, and the 23.5 degree tilt of the Earth's axis. Okay? Throw all those things together, and that's when we're all going to have 12 hours and 12 hours. Okay, but when summer kicks in, June 21st, 22nd, and winter kicks in, or winter, depending on the hemisphere, and December 21st, 22nd, it's going to be completely different, depending on your latitude, of course. Now, where we are in Florida, Central Florida, we're about latitude 29. Is that right? Yeah, latitude 29. So we're not tropical. We're not between the 23.5 latitudes or the 25, depending on how you define tropical. But we're subtropical. So we get about 14 hours of sun, max when summer starts, and we get about 10 hours of sun when winter kicks in December. So we get between 10 and 14 hours. That's a good growing season, 10 and 14 hours all year. But my point here is, in winter, on December 21st, the sun is going to be rising in the southeast, not the east, more of a southeast rise. And when it sets at night, it's more of a southwest setting. Now, in December 21st, it's going to be more of a rise from the northeast, or what we just generally call northeast, and set in the northwest. It's going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to have a different path of sun, and I had to learn all this. I just thought it rises in the east and sets in the west. Big deal. But what this also teaches us about the amount of sun we're going to get in certain areas around our house. The south wall is going to get sun, not as much, but it's going to get sun all year. The north side only going to get some sun. North side of your house only going to get some sun summer months, a little bit during the summer months. And that's one of the reasons why you'll have a mossier area on the northern side of your house. It'll be a little bit more damp. Southern side of your house is going to be a little bit more damp. Now, this is in the northern hemisphere, of course, and the southern hemisphere is going to be the opposite. So you got to know your sun. Knowing your sun is key. Once you get that understanding, and you can plant, and you can design windows in your house, and you can have awnings over your windows to reflect where the sun is and how the sun changes throughout the year. In the winter, you're going to want to have a little more open exposure to the sun in the south, because you're probably going to be a little bit cooler. You want some of that sun to heat your house. In the summer, you're going to want to shade that so you can plant species appropriately. You can design your home appropriately that way, or retrofit it, make it more appropriate. Okay, so know your sun. Stow your water. If sun is key, water is right behind it. Without the sun and the water, we don't get photosynthesis. We don't get anything. We don't get any food, because plants feed the world. They feed the world through photosynthesis. Now that's algae photosynthesis in the ocean. A lot of photosynthesis going on there, where they're taking the sun, and of course the sun and water. You're taking the carbon dioxide, and you're creating carbohydrates. You're creating your own food. Now that food that plants, for example, the terrestrial plants create, is food they use, but they also exude these carbohydrates, these starches and sugars. They make them available to microbes in the soil, and they use them. Some of those microbes say, "Hey, thanks for the food. Hey, here's some nitrogen I just straightened out for you. Since you can't use the nitrogen in the atmosphere, Miss Plant, I can take that dinitrogen that's in the atmosphere, that's everywhere, and I can convert it to, I forget what they're converting, but it's a plant usable form of nitrogen." So, stow your water. We have to have the water. We're going to get some rain. We're going to get if you're lucky enough to have a stream, or you have a wetland like we do. Okay, if water is just passing through your property in the form of a creek, maybe just certain times of the year it's other times of the year it's dry. You have rainfall. Do we just want that water to run off our property? Well, that's a big problem. That's a big problem. In Florida especially, we have stormwater that runs off. It hits the streets. It takes all the toxins, petroleum products, pieces of rubber and trash, and it takes that and it just throws that all into the rivers. We have problems in our rivers. It also takes, the water leaves our property, and it takes with it fertilizer that our plants could not implement. This added fertilizer takes that. Now you have these problems with algae blooms, because we get all these nitrates in the water. All this oxygen is required to break down the decomposing algae when they're through, and then you have dead fish, and on and on and on. So we need to properly store our water. especially in the drier areas, it's more critical. There are people who are permaculturists who have. Jeff Lawton is one big project where he has greened the desert. It's called Greening the Desert. It'd be worthwhile to check it out. Got to store your water. You want to get as many uses of the water that comes to your property as possible before it leaves. How do you store that? With rain barrels. Rain barrels. We found a neighbor had a rain barrel he didn't want. Said, "Do you want it?" I was like, "Oh yes, yes indeed." Put that rain barrel underneath a gutter, and now I can store that water, and I can use that water for irrigation. You can also build some mini ponds or some micro ponds. Store that water. You can use tanks to store the water, so that when you do have a lot of rain, you can save it for the days that you don't. The times of year that you don't. Got to store your water. Now, growing your soil. I know it's not something we see unless you're a soil scientist. We can't see all these microbes in the soil. We just don't know. We can read about it. And I've read and done some research and realized that just a teaspoon of quality soil will have 10,000 amoeba in a teaspoon of soil. 10,000 amoeba, maybe a million fungi, and maybe a billion bacteria. That's a lot of activity in that soil. Well, that's good biology in soil. That's a good soil biology, having all that life in there. Well, if you have all that life in there, they got to eat, right? They need nutrients. They got to eat. So you got to grow your soil. You're not going to have good plants if you don't have good soil. And this is one of the mistakes I made earlier. I was like, I got to stick plants in here, plants in there, plants in there. Well, you can do that. And when you get to a place and you want to set up a garden, you can start doing that. You'll get better results if you get the soil biologically active first. Get a good amount of fungi in there, bacteria, amoeba, and all these other things, earthworms, etc. You get all this soil life in there. I've also read several places that for if you're in a typical natural environment, for every 1,000 pounds of mammal or of life that you have above ground, for every 1,000 pounds, you have 4 to 8 times that underground. And that's mind-blowing. These numbers are mind-blowing to me. I haven't done the research to prove that, but I've read it in enough places where, hey, it's legit. 4 to 8 times. So if you have say 2 large mammals, let's say there's 2 horses on an acre, and that's what I don't know, what is that? 2,000, 3,000 pounds? You have 8 to 10 times that underneath? Mind-blowing. So back to my mnemonic. Know your sun, stow your water, grow your soil. All right. So when I think of permaculture and I think of the ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share, and then the explanation of the fair share concept, I was trying to get clever one day and just compact it to something even easier that might help me remember. And I came up with this: be fair, be the forest. And I've remembered that many times when I've been doing things. Am I emulating the forest? I can go out into my forest area around our property, and I can look around, and I can look at how the trees are doing this, and I can look at, okay, there's nature's compost. Nature's compost is everything that's decomposing. It's the leaves, it's the dead bodies of the critters, it's the snake skin that was shed, it's the lizard skin, it's the detritus. Cool word, the detritus, stuff that comes off of animals and falls. It's leaf litter. It's thick stuff. It happens year after year after year, and it builds up and it becomes humus. And that is the storage of predominantly carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen. Be fair. Be the forest. So that's what I came up with for my abbreviated version of permaculture ethics. Okay, to wind this up or wind it down or whatever I'm doing here. Bill Mollison, in his epic book from 1988, The Permaculture, A Designer's Manual, he had a prime directive for all of us. And this is kind of a recruiting, kind of a revival, come to Jesus moment, if you will, for permaculture. And his prime directive is the only ethical decision is to take responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. The only ethical decision is to take responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. Make it now. That was his rallying call. And this is the first couple of pages in the first chapter of Permaculture. We have a decision to make. Can we make it? Can we take that? Can we do that? Can we take responsibility for ourselves and that of our children? I want to do that. I hope you do too. Thanks for listening. Would-be farmer, and I'm out.